Hi, and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 69. And today we're going to talk about the Archetypist, the tool I developed with Pekka Pulli. And we're having one edition. So we're going to try to use maths to determine good builds of in each color pair that maybe are not as obvious from the generic data, because using that tool, we can go a bit deeper and we can actually find clusters of maybe more niche but successful decks. But before we go into that, this podcast is sponsored by mtgazone.com. You can go there and you can read great articles, including mine. So not all of them great, maybe. I think that the last one was actually quite good. I wrote the topic from the last seminar about speed of the format, but I did it in a sort of style of a murder mystery when I was trying to discover all the clues and figure out what's going on, and I think it worked quite well. But apart from me, if you're bored with my content, there is plenty of good stuff in there. There is J2S Josh writing about limited. There is Paulo Vitor Damodarosa writing strategies about constructed and general gameplay. So there's plenty of stuff in there. So just go click, look for decks. Unfortunately, you can't even tell them that I sent you. But if you do some clicking on my articles, that should convince them that I'm actually a useful asset for them. But the podcast is also sponsored by you, dear listeners, because I have a Patreon, and it's stagnating, but I would assume that's going to happen between formats. If you want to support me additionally, that would be a great thing to do. Also, you get some benefits. For example, you have access to my slides, which might help you consume my content. But on higher tiers, you get extra rewards. You're going to see in a second what kind of luxurious content you can get when you are on the higher tiers of the Patreon. And okay, with that, we can go into the preamble, my usual preamble. And this time, my preamble is that even worst color pairs will have pockets of brilliance. And that is very often lost in generic data. When you look at the data for color pairs, you will see that several color pairs in this format are having a pretty poor win rate. And that doesn't mean that there are no good decks in there. It just means that either they're very tough to build and you have to know exactly what to do in order to get there, or you need to be lucky and it needs to be just exactly the right amount open and you need to have a couple of bombs. And in those cases, it's pretty difficult to um, find the perfect deck in this format, because you need to be in the right seat in the right pod. But in some cases, you will be able to find those decks that are based on commons and uncommons that just don't have the obvious kind of build. And this is why I started doing Archetypist. Archetypist, first of all, is a tool that will let you find successful clusters of decks, but also it finds maybe the more niche builds for even successful color pairs. Because as you will see today, there is a successful poison white and red deck. I had no idea that it exists, but data clearly suggests that it does exist, and you will see how obvious it is when you look at the data, and that such a thing is there. And knowing those things is absolutely useful for you if you are drafting a lot, because the more you draft, the more likely that you're going to be on the table where actually one of those niche decks is opened. And if you know more or less how does it look like, you know exactly what to do, and you might benefit from it rather than wasting your draft, because all the Naya colors in this set are quite heavily drafted, and maybe knowing what to do to have a successful blue green deck or successful blue red deck might be useful for that. Okay, done with the preamble. But now, as a Patreon mogul, I also have duties to my patrons, and Mercurio Blue is my top tier patron. Therefore, he gets to choose a listener question. Now, the more of those patrons we'll get, the less chance that Mercurio is going to be the one that picks the question, because, of course, I will select from multiple submissions than what we are going to do. But since we only have Mercurio, he gets 100% exclusive access to question of the week. And then his question was, which cards are the most misplayed cards in one? And Obviously, the question is very vague, which is great for me because I can pick my hill to die on, and basically I can decide what does it mean misplayed, and make myself make life easier for myself. Um, in this case, I decided to understand misplay as cards that are played too often based on their win rate. And that opens a very easy, simple, and elegant analysis for me, from which I actually learned something about the distribution of the gameplay to win rate that I didn't expect. So what I did, first of all, is oh, where's my trusty laser? We need a trusty laser. I plotted all the cards, and in this graph you have all the commons. I selected them by rarity, and I only looked at commons and uncommons because I thought that's probably paying my dues to the society. I plotted all the cards based on how many games were played. So here we have cards that are played the most, and here we have cards that are played the least. And then game and hand win rate. And it's you probably should expect the cards that are played more frequently are good cards, therefore they have a higher win rate. And the I checked different trend lines, and I chose the one that fits those dots the best. Because it seems like the cards that are played the least are really, really bad, and that's why they are played the least. But then it sort of flattens and increases slightly slower. So I fitted a sort of logarithmic curve into it, and I got the equation. I got the fit r squared. That number tells us how well does this trend line fit with those points, or more precisely, how well do those points fit with this trend line. And the number 0.72934, it says that the trend line explains sort of 73% of the variance between those points, which is a really good fit actually. So what I can say from looking at those numbers is that how often do 17 lens users play a particular card is a good predictor of the win rate. But of course, there are some cards that are slightly higher than the trend line. There are some cards that are slightly lower than the trend line. And based on that, I decided to measure the distance from the trend line of each point and pick 10 cards that are furthest from it as the cards that are most misplayed, because they are played as cards that have a win rate of here, but have a win rate of here. So, for example, this point has a win rate of around 52%, and based on how it's often displayed, it should have a win rate of around 55%. And here is the top 10 misplayed commons. Number one is Ichor Synthesizer, the blue 1/3 that can become a 3/3 unblockable. Then we have Mesmeric Dose, the blue Charmed Sleep card. Experimental Augury, Prologue to Phyresis, Gixian Raptor, Gitaxian Raptor, all of them are blue. So all the cards that are misplayed are blue. So basically what this data tells us is that the biggest misplay of all is playing blue in this format. And that's a sad conclusion. There is one card that definitely I felt was overplayed. I'm a big Prophetic Prism hater, independent of the format. I think that this card was probably never that good. Although I can imagine formats where it would be okay. I think that maybe it was good in the first printing, but then it just like cruised on its reputation in other formats when people were playing it because they remembered it was good in the previous ones. But I never found it particularly important, attractive, and well, yeah, that kind of stuff. Then we have Anoint with Affliction. So a really solid black removal, but it is underperforming compared to how often it's being played. I think that it's nothing to do with the power of the card, because the card is powerful on its own. I think that the problem is to play it, you need to play black, and black is still overdrafted, and then because black is overdrafted, Anoint with Affliction is weaker than the card is on paper. I think that Anoint with Affliction has the same problem as Feed the Serpent and Kaldheim. Feed the Serpent is a 4-mana exile target creature instant spell. And it's a great card. It's just that Kaldheim had a pretty tough relationship with black, and that I think dropped the win rate of the card, even though the card itself was good. the surroundings of it made it a bit weaker. So Annoyed with Affliction might be misplayed, not because the card is poor, but because black is not so great. And then we have Malcater's Watcher, Bring the Ending, another bunch of blue cards, and Blight Belly Rat, black common. Again, Toxic Black Creature will be almost certainly overdrafted by the arena population. Therefore, it's hard to find pods where this color and especially Toxic from this color is being open. Yeah, I'm going to answer a question from you every week. I just picked one of the two that you gave me last week because I did the last one. But hey, there's more. Not only I'm going to look at the most misplayed commons, but I'm going to also look at the most misplayed uncommons. So I made a separate curve from the uncommons. It's the same situation, logarithmic curve. I have the equation. I have the R squared. So this sort of the trend line explains 73% of the variance we're observing, consistent with the previous graph when it was also 73% roughly. So yeah, obviously you can see that this card, for example, is a bargain because it's probably underplayed compared to how good it is. And this one is underplayed, so I'm measuring the difference between where the trend line is and where the points are and looking for the ones that are the furthest from the trend line. So here we have Mirror Convert as the most misplayed uncommon. Again, a card that I will like way more than Prophetic Prism in theory, but it just doesn't work very well in this format, it seems. Because the card looks great. It has some offensive capabilities because it's a toxic creature. It can fix your mana at a cost, but it can fix your mana. It's also an early blocker if you need one, but it just didn't deliver in this format. And also splashing was not a smart idea most of the time. Said the man who trophied with a Jund deck. So yeah, it's possible, but it just it's not always going to happen. Of course, being misplayed doesn't mean that the card is always bad. It just means that if you would take an average game that the card was played, probably it shouldn't have been played. There will be probably decks where it's going to be great. No. Mirror Convert is the 2/1 that taps for mana of any color and has Toxic 1 and is a 2/1 for 2. Then we have Prosthetic Injector, the equipment that gives Toxic and +0/+2 to your creatures. Thrumming Bird, that's a blue card, so it fits the previous trend of the blue cards being basically misplayed because you shouldn't play blue, as the data suggests. Then we have Churning Reservoir. I think that this card is also good in very narrow homes. And actually, I'm super happy that we're doing Archetypist today because we will be able to find, I think, a cluster where Churning Reservoir was good in red-green decks. So we can see what makes the Churning Reservoir deck tick. It's nice because I ran out of time to do that analysis, but I also was planning to maybe do Archetypist for individual cards. And I wanted to make exactly Churning Reservoir, and I wanted to make the white enchantment that whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, creature gets +1/+1 and vigilance, and try to find which decks are good decks that contain this card. Chitterling Skitterling, also overplayed. Magmatic Sprinter. Chitterling Skitterling, the 1/4 that you can sacrifice creatures if you have corrupted this ability for nothing, and then you draw a card. Magmatic Sprinter, that's the 3/2 with haste that puts 2 oil counters on a target creature, and then at the end of your turn, you either remove 2 oil counters from it or return it to your hand. Troller Drake, that's another in the blue thing. I mean, a card is good, but again, hampered by the color it's in. Ichorplate Golem, I think that this card also will see some homes for it, but is, I think, overplayed. And I think people try to put it in decks where it shouldn't be, and that probably makes it overplayed. I think it has narrow homes, and people try to play it more wide. Serum Core Chimera and Tamiyo's Immobilizer, they fit into the trend of blue things not being great. Tamiyo's Immobilizer, of course, it's a good card. It's just probably not the reason to be blue. It's a probably reward for having other cards that put you into the blue, and then you can play Tamiya's Immobilizer. And I'm pretty sure that people splash Tamiya's Immobilizer also when they shouldn't. So yeah, these are the most misplayed cards. Again, lots of blue cards and lots of cards that want to promote this dirtly kind of gameplay, which is high risk and will only work when you have a very specific deck. So off to the main topic: ecology and magic. So I am an ecologist. That's my job. I do ecology things every day in my work. And ecology is, of course, the study of interactions between species and the ecosystem. My specialty is microbial ecology. I look at the communities of bacteria and I try to figure out what makes them tick. And to do so, I have to look at very complex networks of species. My bacterial ecosystems, they have something like 1 billion bacteria per 1 ml. That contains thousands of species. Most of them I can't even find unless I go really hardcore on sequencing. Um, and yeah, I basically have to figure out how those networks operate by looking at the interactions with them and trying to manipulate them in an experimental way. Because I am an experimental ecologist, I can actually manipulate them and change something myself. So I can change the feeding regime, or I can introduce an antibiotic and see what happens to my communities and which communities behave in which way. Are there some universal trends and stuff like that? Of course, there are other ecologists that study natural systems, and then they cannot manipulate them. They have to see what happens in them and infer from what's happening in them what's going on inside of the bacterial community. Um, and ecosystems can exhibit some kind of a measurable function. So, for example, if you have a marine ecosystem, you can measure, let's say, CO2 assimilation. You can measure photosynthesis in ecosystems in the sea, and then you can see which bacteria are incorporating CO2, which are important for that, and how the photosynthesis in the sea is working. And also, by measuring the function, you can assess the health of the ecosystem. I work on the bacteria that produce methane. And in my case, it's very easy. If they produce a lot of methane, they will be healthy, because if they don't produce methane, they accumulate acetate, so sort of acid vinegar. And if they accumulate acetate, they kill themselves. Therefore, they die out. So basically, for me, the more methane they produce, the better they do. And that's very easily measurable function. And by doing that, we can draw conclusions on what are the key species, like which species is missing, and then the function of my ecosystem is suffering. I can figure that out, and then I can do my manipulations better, and I can suggest people who want to produce biogas how to do that. And I can also suggest people who want to stop methane production in natural systems how to make that happen. That was a lot of science that has nothing to do with magic. Yes, that's very good description, MTM. I play God to a bunch of farting bacteria. That's exactly what I'm doing. Um, Although they don't seem to worship me, judging by my last experiments that failed miserably. Maybe they're going through the enlightenment period. Um, so ecology and magic. How do I link that to magic, actually? Because it was a nice tangent, but I mean, I'm pretty sure that most of you want to hear about magic, not about my struggles of making bacteria do what I want them to do. How to compare different ecosystems and decks. Um, is there a missing thing? There we go. There's definitely a missing thing. Ecology and magic. So magic decks are interactions between cards in metagame. If you go back, ecology and bacteria was interactions between species and ecosystems. So cards and in a metagame, so cards will be like species, and metagame decks will be like ecosystems. Decks are complex networks of multiple card types. That's the definition of ecosystem. So each card in the deck will play some sort of a function, and decks can exhibit some kind of a measurable function, which can be, for example, a win rate. And that's what we're going to be measuring. By measuring win rate, we can assess the power of the deck. And by doing that, we can also draw conclusions on what are the key cards and how and what are the key helpers of those key cards. So basically, the idea is to compare different ecosystems slash decks and try to cluster them based on their composition similarities. And then when we cluster them based on their similarities, we can assign secondary traits onto them, like for example, the win rate. So an example, this is a picture of 2000 decks converted to numbers. So I took composition of those decks and I sort of converted those compositions into distance matrices in multi-dimensional space. Then I used the mathematical equivalent of splatting something flat, and that creates this sort of two-dimensional plot. Basically, what you need to know about this plot is that the closer two dots are to each other, the more similar they are. So, like these ones will be sort of similar, but this and this will be quite different from each other. But of course, if you see that kind of random blob, some bloody pop-up coming out. I hate what's going on in there. Whoa! Do you see? Okay, yeah. Stupid Epic Games started popping out in the middle of my slide. Thank you very much, Epic Games, for bringing magic, but not for the pop-ups. Of course, this blob doesn't tell you anything. It's just a blob of same color dots. So how do we make something useful out of it? And this is where some smart application of function comes in handy. I can look at the local win rate. So I can check the average win rate of each deck and its neighbors. I thought that looking at the win rate of the deck only is problematic because there is a lot of variance in how decks perform. Very often you have this, trophy deck that goes 0-3. Very often you just get a trophy with a random deck that you were not expecting to go higher than 2-3. But if you look at multiple decks, you might actually get somewhere. And then you can apply that to the plot. So looking at the win rates of the deck and its neighbors looks like this, that I take a deck and I find in this example, 15 closest neighbors. In my data, I'll actually look at the 19 closest neighbor plus the deck itself. So I look at the 20 deck clusters. And I calculate the win rate of all those decks. So if this one went 7-2, this one went 1-3, I just add all those things up and calculate the win rate of those 20 decks. This, of course, increases the sample size and should reduce the variance and make some kind of consistency. And then I look at the same thing for another deck. And of course, it will have similar but slightly different neighbors. And, if these were very successful and these ones are not successful, there will be quite a difference between the win rate of this deck and this deck. So the ones that are close should have, in theory, like relatively similar win rates. But if you go further and further, you will see big difference, and they should be also uniform. So that allows me to look at those clusters of successful decks. And then there are several possible scenarios. This is one scenario. We have decks that are great, very good, medium, and underperformers. That's just for example. I mean, you don't need to. There's nothing like it's sort of arbitrarily assigned. And one possible scenario is that good decks are random. And here you see like a patchwork of all the dots mixed together. So good decks are next to the great decks and next to the underperformers, and there's no sense in that. And this is a picture of a random format where actually what you have in your deck doesn't matter. All the cards are playable or all the cards are rubbish, and everything depends on how you play and how lucky you were on the draws. So the composition of your decks is absolutely, it means nothing really. Obviously, we don't expect to see that scenario, but that's one possibility. And I think that maybe there are some formats where those kind of things were happening, where flat level of power was so flat that you actually get this patchworky kind of structure. But there are other scenarios possible, and here is one where there is general one good build. You see that there's a bunch of gray decks, and you see this blue cluster will mean that these are all the good decks, and they are all in the same place, which means that they're all similar to themselves. And this is typical for a color pair where there is one consensus build that is good, and other builds are just rubbish. And we will see, I think, one of those in the Archetypist today. Actually, one of the color pairs has really one strong, successful build, and the rest just looks mediocre. And I think that the most common scenario is that there are several good builds, Maybe one of them is dominant and maybe one of them is niche. But there are several builds, slightly different or sometimes quite different from each other. And we can look at all those clusters using the Archetypist tools. The Archetypist by Pekka Pulli and me. So I provide the data. Pekka Pulli provides amazing visualizing skills. And it's a tool for visualizing the ecology-like data in Magic Decks. And without further ado, I will stop the presentation and we can actually look at the Archetypist itself. Break. Okay, Archetypist is here. Okay, so here is the Archetypist by Pekka and me. And so what you will see below is a plot of 1000 recent, and here you can choose the color pair. Best of one draft decks in Phyrexia LB1 on Magic Arena. Similar decks are closer to each other on the map, and decks with more wins have bigger dots. So for example, you can see this is probably like a decent deck. Can you see the cursor? Yeah. And this is probably not so good. Each deck is given a value according to the average win rate of it, and it's 19 really closest neighbors. And decks above 60%, and here I can actually play with that. So it can be any number within the limits, I think, are highlighted in blue, and decks below the overall average win rate, 55% in case of this format, are light red. Blue clusters can help define different strong deck composition of the color pair. Create boxes by dragging on the graph to explore clusters. So first deck that we have is white-blue. And I can play with this number a bit to see where the clusters sort of start. And I think that I can see that there is like 2 major clusters, I think. One will be somewhere here of successful decks, obviously. There are many clusters of rubbish decks in blue-white. And one is here, and maybe there's one here. Let's look at that as well. So let's see what is inside of those. Let's start with cluster 0, so the one that popped out first, and then cluster 1. So what we have when we look into the cluster, we have the average win rate of the cluster, which is converted in on average number of wins. So these are all on average like sort of 4-3, 5-3 decks, which is decent for if you play Arena, because that means you're getting your gems back. We have 64 decks in this cluster, so 64 decks with 4.3 wins. That's quite a lot. That's hundreds of wins are made by those decks. And main 2 cards that we see: Eye of Malcator, 2.4 average copies per deck, and Mandible Justiciar, 1.6 average copies per deck. Then we have Escaped Experiment. That's the 2/1 for 2. That whenever that attacks, target defending creature will get -X/-O. Surgical Skull Bomb, Chrome Prowler, the Downcat, Malcator's Watcher, Cephalopod Sentry. All these cards are having 1 or more copies on average across those 64 decks, which is impressive. Furthermore, what you can see is this gray line here. This one tells us what is the average in the archetype altogether. So like across all the 1000 decks, you will probably have like an average of 1 copy of Eye of Malcator, but 2.4 is way more than the 1. So there is definitely an overrepresentation of the Eye of Malcator in those decks. You have slightly more Anctus Retrofitters than average would suggest. But for example, one card that you have lower numbers of is Mesmerizing Dose. Normally, you probably have like 0.8 copies, and in these decks you have 0.5 copies. So that one is lower. You have very few Basilica Skull Bombs, few Charge of the Mites, but yeah, generally this is the build where you have artifact, 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 not an artifact, but synergistic with artifacts, not an artifact, but important, artifacts, artifact payoff, artifact mm, underplayed, something artifact, something that brings artifacts potentially. So you can see that the composition of those successful decks is like really heavy on having artifacts. You can look at some of the 7-win deck lists, and you have 4 Mandible Justiciar, 3 Eye of Malcator, 2 Chrome Prowlers, 2 Incisor Gliders, Malcator's Watchers. All of those things are artifacts. You have 2 Plated Onslaught, so this is like a very aggressive version of this deck. Somehow, Tamiya's logbook somehow made it in there, but anyway. 2 Veils of Assimilation. Exactly, someone is noticing the card that I plan to maybe look at. Where's the success for that? Well, clearly in this deck, because if everything that you play is an artifact, Veil of Assimilation is actually a good card, especially when you have, something like what's the name, Cephalopod Sentry in your deck. Then you can actually attack, block very well, and win the game like that. I lost a couple of games to this kind of combination. And other decks are sort of similar. There is 3 Justiciars, 2 Cephalopod Sentries, and 2 Eyes of Malcator. Some cheap creatures in Dune Mover and Escape Experiment that are also artifacts in Scissor Glider. They play Mace Bomb, Mace Skull Bomb, just probably to pad the artifact count. Vial of Assimilation is also here. Unctus, Mycosynth Gardens. So, like all in kind of artifact strategy in this cluster. We look at the second cluster. This one looks pretty similar, but it has fewer Eyes of Malcator. Instead of 2.4, we have 1.6 copies. It's called Archetypist. I'll give the link at the end of the presentation, I think, for it. But I think it's Googleable, I'm pretty sure, because it's been around for a while. But this is the tool that I'm developing, and then it's actually designed for playing with it. So you're happy to play with it. Archetypist.net, netlify.app. That's the link for it. Wait a second. I'm just going to copy it and paste. There we go. So it's a very much similar version. It just changes it slightly, the amounts of those cards. So it's not different from the first cluster. And let's look at the third one. Is it very different? I think the third one is clustering much further from these two, so it looks like it's a different type. And what you can see is that this one only has 0.7 copies of Eye of Malcator per deck, which means that here we found a sub-build of blue-white that doesn't want to use the Eye of Malcator, but it's still successful, which is nice. It has Chrome Prowlers as the top card, but it also has a lot of Mesmerizing Doses, something that we didn't want to see in the previous decks. They were actually underplayed compared to the average. In this cluster, they are actually, you actively want to have them. You still have a Cephalopod Sentry, 1.2 copies per deck. So this deck is probably wants to have Cephalopod Sentries as a sort of defensive/offensive creature. There's Malcator's Watchers. There's Planar Disruptions. So we already had Mesmerizing Dose as the enchantment removal and Planar Disruption as an enchantment removal. So it looks like slightly control-y version. You can see that it has 0.6 copies of Malcator Overseer of Purity. So this is a rare. So having 0.6 copies of it in those decks means quite a lot, actually, because it's so hard to get that kind of those kind of numbers of a rare in your deck, which means that these builds are built heavily around Malcator. And I'm pretty sure that these are sort of blue-white control decks that have some artifact synergies because they are so plentiful, those type of synergies in the deck, in the color combination. But they focus on slowing down the opponent, making sure that their creature are useless by playing those Gitaxian Raptors, by playing those Cephalopod Sentries. If something manages to be too problematic, you have Mesmerizing Those, and you have Planar Disruption to deal with them. And then over time, you will play this cephalopod sentry, grow it, and maybe start chipping in for a couple. You'll have this Malcator to build value over time. You have your Unctus's Retrofitter to produce a 4/4 out of something. You have your down cats that can actually make quite a nice way of racing and blocking and surviving until the moment when you can take over the game. But it's a different build of the white blue that is not based on this Eye of Malcators, but don't worry, this is just the first archetype, so you didn't miss much, Mike. This is just the first archetype that we're going through. So yeah, you're all fine, and it will be released on YouTube, so you can catch up and you can go and play with the archetypes yourselves. Everything is possible. Okay, that's blue white. Two builds basically, one that is super hardcore artifact aggressive, and these are the successful clusters. Let's look at this one. Just yeah, Eye of Malcator a lot. This one will also be Eye of Malcator a lot. Yeah. So all the successful builds have like lots of copies of Eye of Malcator and go absolutely all in on the artifacts. And this may be more niche kind of controlling build is less dependent on the Eyes of Malcator, but it does need a lot of those enchantment removal spells in it. I'm wondering what this one is. This one is something in between, but that's still moderately successful. Let's look at the blue-black now. Order is slightly random. As you can see, here you see a lot of red dots because this archetype is just not very successful. Because it's not very successful, you can clearly see already here that just by looking at the gray, we have 3 cluster, maybe 4th one here. So we will go down a bit with the win rate to localize those clusters. Oh, that's 55, But we still want to see something that's slightly above average. So here, cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, and cluster F. Let's look at that from the bottom. So the first cluster, average 57.7, which is good for blue-black. I mean, you were not going to complain about it. And this is clearly a toxic proliferate hybrid deck. Top card, Blightbelly Rat, 1.3 copies. We have 1.2 copies of Prologue to Phyresis. Fest Pestilent Siphoner, Vraska's Fall. All these cards make poison in some way or another. You have Experimental Augury, the pick one card from 3 and then proliferate. Whisper of the Dross proliferates. Anoint, of course, it's good anyway. Voidwing Hybrid, Toxic Flying Creature. Sheoldred's Head Cleaver, an evasive toxic creature, and a bunch of other things that make toxic. So you're basically quite all in on this toxic strategy in this cluster. And when we look at the trophy decks from that, here we see 2 Prologue to Phyresis, Serum Snare to make the games last longer, Sheoldred's Edict to make the games last longer, because your clock is not as fast. But you have the 2 Head Cleavers, Stinging Hive Master, Annihilating Glare and Annoyed, Blue Sun's Twilight, sort of casually there. But you have like Bring the Ending is good in those decks because it will very often be just a counterspell for 2. Tekuthal, that's another card. Like the two of the cards that from my last week's list of the cards that slow down the games the most, they have that. What else do we have there? I mean, obviously the trophy decks will have a bunch of bombs because that's what trophy decks do. But here we have a deck that has 2 Black Sun Twilights because why wouldn't you? But it also has Pestilent Siphoners. It has 3 Whispers of the Dross, 2 Mesmering Doses, Blightberry Rats. What else? Unctus Retrofitter for some reason. Here we have a deck with 4 Voidwing Hybrids. Here we have a deck with 3 Voidwing Hybrids. Here we have a deck with 4 Prologue to Phyresis and like going absolutely all in on the toxic. 2 Voidwing Hybrids, 2 Stinging Hive Masters. But yeah, I mean, you can see how it actually weirdly how the clustering actually works, because you really see that all those cards are linked by this poison theme, and they do cluster together as if by magic, but that's just math. Here we have cluster number 1, which is this cluster. And in this cluster, we have top cards are Mesmerizing Those and Elemental Augury. We have Blightbelly Rat, Whisper of the Dross, and Prologue to Phyresis, but in much lower numbers. So this is like a less all-in on the toxic decks. And they still have a bunch of those same cards, but I think that this is a less pronounced version of the toxic deck compared to the other one. And here we have a slightly different build. So here we have, again, Experimental Augury, Mesmerizing Dose we have again. We have Anoint with Affliction, because that card is just good. But here we see things like Gitaxian Raptor, doesn't make any toxic. Ichor Synthesizer, doesn't make any toxic. Glistener Seer, all 3 of those cards have actually oil counters. So actually that one, it looks like it's slightly heavier on oil. You're still going to probably try something with Prologue to Phyresis. There is still the Voidwing Hybrid, but you have things like Troller Drake, for example. So this looks like a hybrid deck of oil and toxic synergies, but I think with like heavier emphasis on the oil decks. And I'm pretty sure that here we will find some. Oh yeah, we do. We find some Ichor Plate Golems, for example, and in those decks, because they will at least try to do something with oil. So that's cluster 2, and we have still cluster number 3. That's the one that is really the most far away from the toxic cluster, which was here. And here we have top card is Marcator's Watcher. We have Gitaxian Raptor. We have Elemental Augury. But we also have, like, again, Ichor Synthesizer, Mesmering Dose. So it's more similar to that first deck, to that last kind of cluster. We still have Voidwing Hybrid, just because that card is probably just open. But for example, this one has Quicksilver Fisher in almost 1 copy per deck, which is something surprising. And then we have Chrome Prowler, Anoint with Affliction, Bring the Ending. This is a sort of control-y version of those decks, I think. Yeah, that's a good one. Maybe I should convince Pekka, because it's always tough to I always try to filter them, and it takes me time. But if they will, maybe the color of the card name will be in the color of the rarity would be useful. That's a very good suggestion, Arashka. So yeah, this looks like slightly different build that is more kind of control-y, good stuff, finishing with big flyers while controlling the game with some removal and good defensive creatures. That's, I think, obviously all those decks should contain some bombs, because why should you even be in blue when you don't have good bombs? That's the question. Let's maybe look at this cluster. I don't expect much from it, but let's look at it. Cluster number 4. That looks like it doesn't make much sense, and it would be not surprising for me that it doesn't make much sense. Okay, black-red. Okay, black-red, we need to play around with the win percentages again to see the clusters better. So the first cluster will start here, and then we have a couple of others. So let's look at this cluster, this cluster, this cluster. So I can tell you already, like, as a spoiler, these are all decks with Charforgers, I'm pretty sure. Okay, first one, cluster 0, 61% win rate, so solid. Top card, Axeman Graveyard, then Chimney Rabble, Furnace Strider, Hexgold Slash, Barbed Butterfist, Volt Charger, and then Charforger. Red, 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 Charforger, red, 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 red. So this is basically red decks with a Charforger and some, maybe a couple of other black cards. When we look at the trophy decks, Butterfist, 2 Charforgers, Chimney Rebels, Furnace Striders, Hazardous Brass, Archfiend of the Dross. Okay, that's why you played black. I get you. I get you. And then red card, 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 red card. Testament Bearer, another really good card for that kind of decks. Urabrask and Volt Charge, also red. So this one has a grand total of 4 black cards in it, and quite a lot of swamps actually, because they play a double pipped Archfiend of the Dross. But yeah, I mean that's one way of playing black red. I think that playing a heavy red deck that does have some black cards that you manage to get along the way. Yeah, Testament Bearer is the 4-1 that dies into the Organ Hoarder's ETB ability, basically. Cluster number 1, top card in it, Charforger. Again, no surprises. Volt Charge, Annihilating Glare, Chimney Rubble, Hexgold Slash. So in the top 5 cards for these archetype, you have 3 removal spells, which probably tells you something, because then you just go slightly lower, you get Anoint with Affliction. This is the kind of black red deck that you have some good 2-for-1 creatures, Charforger, Chimney Rubble, and a bunch of removal, and that should be enough to win the game, because you kill a lot of their stuff, and at the same time, you have so much removal that you can deal with the opponent's threats, and then in the end, you might as well kill them with the 1/1 leftover tokens from the Chimney Rubble and Charforger. This looks like very much an attrition archetype. Also, Annihilating Glare with 2 Charforgers and 2 Chimney Rubbles seems like a good plan. So sort of like removal control mid-range deck, I would say. Of course, it has to have early creatures in this format, because you just need to have early creature. Cluster 2, 4 wins roughly on average. Furnace Strider being the top card for that one. And you have Charforger, Chimney Rubble, Batterfist, Hexgold Slash. We saw all those cards before. So again, good cards. This one is a bit more on the chunkier side because of the number of Furnace Striders, I think. But then again, all the trophy decks will always have some sort of bombs. Wait, do I see an 18 land deck? Interesting. Another cluster, 4.1 wins on average, 1.5 Charforgers on average, and that's the top card for the archetype. And here we have Barb Batterfist, Hexgold Slash, Volt Charge, Chimney Rubble, Anoint. Same things, just in a different proportion. All of those decks, even though they cluster separately, look pretty similar, which means that this is not a very diverse archetype in terms of where success lies. Cluster number 4, also Charforger, Hexagon Slash, Chimney Rubble, blah, 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 all the same things. I don't see anything different in there. It just like differs in ratio between them, and one cluster had much more removal. And the last 5th cluster, same thing. Bunch of Hexgold Slashes, Charforgers, Axiom Engravers, all that kind of stuff. It's basically a red oil deck with some black splash. You don't see any of those kind of weird sacrifice decks that maybe you could speculate before the format. And this is a bad cluster, so I'm not going to explore it. Right, red-green. You see the difference in the number of nice dots in red-green? Red-green will have definitely several clusters, but you have to go to 70% win rate to actually stop seeing blue dots. So this is the most successful cluster. Let's take a look here, 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 maybe like here and here. Because it's red-green, it's the biggest and the most successful color combination in the format so far. So, cluster number 1. Average win rate 65%. That's great for a cluster of 20 decks. And you have 42 decks inside, so that covers quite a lot. Top plate card, cool. Kuldotha Cackler. I don't think it's because that's so important, but I think that's that because it's so available. Then you have Predation Steward, Oil Gorger Troll, Lattice Blade Mantis, Vorak, Axiom Engraver. So far, Oil Payoff, Oil Enabler, Oil Payoff, Oil Enabler, really good card, Oil Enabler. Hexagon Slash, and here we have the Churning Reservoir. These are those Churning Reservoir decks. When you have also Urbrask's Anointers, Furnace Riders. For some reason, the Google self-corrected names of the cards, and we have Rusty Cultivator rather than Rustvine. That's what it goes. But a bunch of those cards will have oil, and there will be a bunch of oil payoffs. And I'm pretty sure that the trophy decks are peppered with bloated contaminators and things like that. But importantly, this cluster shows you how the decks look like when they want to have Churning Reservoir actively. And that's basically it. Put good oil payoffs in large numbers, pepper in some just generically good cards like Contagious Vorak, and you should be good to go. I think that these decks are also slightly different in a way that they don't run that many copies of Blazing Crescendo. Although some will, but it's not many copies of those. Right, cluster number 1, 66% win rate. That's really great. And here we have the top card being Lattice Blade Mantis, Furnace Strider, Kuldotha Cackler. So same kind of thing, like bigger of those oil-linked threats. Free from Flash, Axiom Engraver, Contagious Vorak, Predation Steward, Cinder / Ravager. So this is your classic Ravager oil deck. Yeah, and I mean it has all the good cards, but what you want to see is that it's pretty flat in what it has. So it doesn't really matter that much if you have Furnace Strider or Lattice Blade Mantis. They're quite interchangeable. And I think that this is like a big part of why red green was such a good color. It was underdrafted, but also there was a lot of flexibility in which cards you put in that didn't damage your win rate. Like in white blue, it will be problematic for you if on your pod you will not open many of the Justiciars. Okay. What do we have in this one? Axiom Engraver, Furnace Strider, Chimney Rubble, Blazing Crescendo, Free from Flash, Rusty Cultivator, Rustvine Cultivator, Kuldotha Cackler, Vorak, Volt Charge. Similar deck. This one has both Blazing Crescendo and Free from Flash as 1 copy per deck. So this is the ground creature aggro oil deck that wants to use combat tricks. 1.4 engraver per deck, but I'm sure that there will be some that don't have any and some that have a lot. But that's also again small differences between this and the other. Here we have another cluster, 63% win rate. Predation Steward, Axiom Engraver, Cackler, Mantis, Volt Charge, Rustvine Cultivator, All Gorger Troll, Cinder / Ravager. This is the one that has a very U-shaped mana curve, I think. It's like a bunch of 2-drops, then nothing much, and then just Cinder / Ravager and Oil Gorger Troll. So U-shaped curved kind of aggressive oil deck. We have here Hexagon / Butterfist Rubble. It's more or less the same, to be fair. I mean, it's a big cluster, but it seems like the problem with red green or benefit of it, I think, is that there's lots of replaceable powered creatures in those decks, and you're happy to play them. Like here, for example, Blade Graph Aspirant is the card that maybe is on the weirder side, and they play Branch Blight Stalkers as well in this version, and Shrapnel Singer. So this one like definitely overdoes it on 2-drops for some reason. Cluster number 5, Engraver, Mantis, Furnace Strider. You see all these three appearing on and on. Rasvine Cultivator, Kuldothas Cackler, Chimney Rubble, Hexel Slash, da 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 la di da. Arashka, that's a sweet combo. Cinderlash and Offer Immortality. I think that's something that you want to do at least once in this format, just to see the hatred in your opponent's face. Yeah, these were the clusters, and I have to say, I mean, they were all quite samey. And I think that this is mainly because, yeah, green red is just very reproducible. What do we have when we go a bit further? We have Oil Gorger Troll kind of cluster, but it only has 61% win rate, just much higher than anything blue black could have had to offer. Okay, that's red green, nothing important. White green. Here I can hope to expect some differential clusters. So let's look at this one that is far away from everything else. This one that is far, this one, and the big one. So let's look at the one that was the outlier. What do we have here? Vorak, Stalker, Attendant, Shepherd, Predation, Complete Devotion, Plague Nurse. So this is definitely looking for Toxic. I mean, when we look at the top cards, and yes, Terramorphic Expanse, yes, Contagious Vorak, but apart from that, Stalker, Toxic. Indoctrination Attendant, Toxic. Basilica makes might that are toxic. Okay, Ruthless Predation Removal, Complete Devotion, Toxic Synergy, Plague Nurse, Toxic Enabler, and a Toxic Creature. Incisor Glider, Toxic Reward. Duelist of Deep Faith, Toxic Creature. Cleansing Raptor, Toxic Creature. Slaughter Singer, Toxic Creature. Tyrannex Atrocity, Toxic Creature. Crawling Chorus, Toxic Creature. So even though the numbers of the cards are quite flat, you can see a clear trend in this wanting to be a toxic deck. Oh yeah, as Wraithbone 81 mentioned, mainly green toxic in that deck. Although, you know, at the lower end we had Flensing Raptors, Duelists of the Deep Faith, but this deck looks like, you know, well, no, there's also Shepherd and Indoctrination Attendant. There is some stuff that is not green, but it actually leans quite heavy on those green creatures. Even like Tyrannex Atrocity, the 5-mana 4/4 haster, even Plague Nurse found the space in this particular build, to the tune of 60% win rate across 32 decks. Cluster number 1, we have a bunch of Contagious Voraks, Ruthless Predation, Lattice Blade Mantis, Predation Steward, Cultivator, Evolving Adaptive. So first 6 cards are all white, and then only we have Flensing Raptor, but then we go back to Incubation Sacs, Branch Bike, Stalker, and actually Titania's Growth is played there more. So yeah, this looks like green deck with some white cards added to it. And also you can look from the ratio of lands in the trophy decks. 9/7, 9/7, 8/6, 9/8. In most of them, there is more forest than plains. Cluster 2, 61% win rate. Flensing Raptor, Complete Devotion, Branch Blight Stalker, Basilica Shepherd, Planar Disruption, Chart of the Might, Crawling Chorus, Incisor Glider, Duelist of Deep Face, Zilix, Conviction, Vorak, Indoctrination Attendant, Sinew Dancer, Luther's Predation, Tyrannex Atrocity. Most of those cards are white. So this is the white version of the green-white Toxic. With some notable exceptions of Branch Blight Stalker, which is an important 2-drop, I guess, for them. Especially good when you have Flensing Raptors. Cluster number 3, the last one that I'm going to look at. Flensing Raptor, Complete Devotion, Duelist, Crawling Chorus, Zealous Conviction, blah, blah, blah. Bunch of white cards with Branch Blight Stalker added in. And even Ichor Basilisk, Ichor Spit Basilisk is even made the cut, and Plague Nurse in many of those decks. If it works, it works. Okay, white green did white black. Is that the one? No, wrong direction. So these are our 4 clusters. We just need to develop them a bit. Okay, cluster 1, cluster 2. Whoop. Okay, let's take this cluster and let's take this cluster. Okay, cluster 0. White, black. Here we have top card. Crawling Chorus, Complete Devotion, Indoctrination Attendant, Raptor, Glider, Duelist, Shepherd, Chart of Minds. It's really a bunch of toxic synergies. One interesting thing maybe is that it plays more Zealous Convection than the average deck. And it definitely leans heavily on the Basilica Shepherd with 1 copy per deck on average. Cluster 1, win rate 63.8, and it has 1.5 crawling choruses in the deck. Duelist of Deep Faith is close second, so it definitely is the very early mono white almost kind of toxic deck when black plays the support role by having Pestilence Siphoner, Stinging Hive Master, and some removal. So yeah, very aggressive version of a toxic deck, to be fair. And the one that actually looks like it's trying to kill with poison damage. Cluster 2, which is the third cluster. Hive Master, Rat, Siphoner, Anoint, Whisper of the Dross, Bone Picker, Scourge. So 6 out of the 6 top cards are black. So yeah, this means that we have a black-white rather than white-black version of the archetype. Notably, it wins slightly less. It's got like 60% win rate, 3.9. And cluster 3, the one that is the furthest, again, Siphoner, Siphoner, Blightberry Rat, Bone Picker, Scourge, Anoint with Affliction, Bilious, Skull Dweller, Annihilating Glare. Everything has, except for that poor Testament Bearer, everything in that list has something to do with toxic. Oh, sorry, and there is also the Sphere Lands, which I don't count. But important to see that in this deck, even though it's so heavily on toxic, there is fewer complete devotions on average. And if it's across 20-something decks with their 20 neighbors, I think that you can sort of trust that one. Definitely, they have more Bilious Skull Dweller, the one once with Death Touch anymore than anything. Okay. Do I want to check those clusters if they add something to the table? Cluster number 4, we have Crawling Chorus, Rat, Raptor, Siphoners, Hive Master. Yeah, not much to overthink there. 5, Chorus, Siphoner, Affliction, Glider, Raptor, Whisper of the Dross, Duelist. So Deep Fate is, again, it's a classic toxic poison deck. And the last cluster of, let's see, cluster 3, which one was that? Yeah, okay, I know, okay. I got lost a bit. I'm falling asleep as I stream. That would be the first if streamer falls asleep while streaming. And the last cluster, cluster 6, Basilica Shepherd being the top card and being quite drafted quite highly. Also, this is the build where Mandible Justiciar in black-white does seem to be helping because they have 0.8 copies of it, and the win rate is pretty decent. Okay, the color with least identity, black green, but lacking personality, but having successful clusters. So let's see what they have in them. And maybe this one has a bonus. Okay, let's see cluster 0. Um, Vorak is the most popular common, which can't really surprise me. Rasvine cultivator there, so I guess you're doing some oil shenanigans and casting more expensive spells. Mantis, Predation, Oil Gorger Troll, Testament Bearer, Adaptive Sport Singer, Stinging Hive Master, like bunch of the kind of value cards. And I think that it's important to know that there's not only all in kind of toxic strategies. Um, and anyway, I think that black green does not yield that many opportunities of doing the kind of black green toxic. I think that the Rot Priest was more splashed than played in the black green decks. Here we have another deck: Vorak, Anoint, Mantis, Stalker, Predation Steward, Rusty Cultivator, Ruthless Predation, some removal on top of that, Stinging Hive Master, Blight Belly Rat. There's plenty of stuff that can put poison counters and or proliferate, and I think that that's what this deck is trying to do. Or should I say these decks? Cluster 2, that's only 56% win rate, which is less interesting for this particular course seminar. And then 54, that's also too little. Okay, so we had the clusters for black, green, blue, green. Now that's the color that I'm interested. Oh, question. We got a question from NLI10. How would you find, for example, the Atraxa decks? So that is something that I said earlier in the seminar I planned to do, but did run out of time. What I plan to do is take decks that do contain particular card. Now, Atraxa is specific because the sample size is quite low on it on Atraxa. But I would just do the same analysis, but instead of analyzing decks that are of particular color combination, I would just take decks that contain Atraxa and find successful clusters of those decks. Because if every deck has Atraxa, then at least I know that I'm testing Atraxa decks. Yep, makes sense, hopefully. So here we have the blue-green. I don't want that cluster. Bad. Sometimes making squares be so hard. Yeah, that's enough, I think. Cluster 0, 58% win rate in green blue, which is not bad judging the average win rate of this color combination. And here, okay, that's I think a very easy cluster. Gitaxian Raptor, Oil Gorger Troll, Lattice Blade Mantis, Skullbomb, Vorak, Ichor Synthesizer, Mesmeric Dose, Ruthless Predation, Glistening Sear, bunch of oil stuff. That looks to me like the decks where oil will be shining. And we have cluster 1, that's only 55% win rate, so probably not worth digging too deep into it. Of interest, it has a lot of Ichor synthesizers, for example. Cluster 2, 57% win rate. Now I'm interested in blue-green decks that have 56-7% win rate. Yeah, Olgorger Troll, Gitaxian Raptor, Augury for proliferating those oil counters, Ichor Synthesizer to maybe turn into a thread that will slowly ping the opponent down. Mantis, Seer, all those things have oil counters and you can proliferate them. What else? I mean, yeah, that's just a straightforward oil kind of build. Number 3, Mercator's Watcher Prophetic Prism. So here we're definitely doing something different. Here we're having blue-green artifacts. Is it possible? Watcher, Prism, Skullbomb. Okay, then we have Raptor, Mesmeric Dose, Experimental Augury, Contagious Vorak, Lattice Blade, Mantis, or Gorget Troll. Yeah, so some artifact synergies, but it seems like the user didn't follow up on them and decided to play it just as a sort of attrition kind of card. And the last chapter, 57.6, that's good for that archetype. Contagious Vorak, 1.2 copies. Tainted Observer, the signpost for the Vorak Observer, that's a proliferate package. We have some Dune Movers, so maybe some splashing going on, and Terramorphic Expanse, um, uh, Glistening Sears, and Augury for card selection. And then some early creatures like Canker Bloom, for example. I'm pretty sure that some of those decks will be splashing. You can see there's the Swamp. What are they splashing? Kaito. Wow, they played the Gauntlet and Trophy. Congratulations. Must have been nice. Do we have any here? We have a Swamp here. Again, Kaito. Which one is Azuri Stalker of the Spheres? I don't even know what that card is. Oh, that's the one. I actually played it in one of my decks. That's the one that proliferates twice and draw. Yeah. Green blue, not green black. Yeah. I get it. I actually played that card. Well, another deck with Kaito. So is this cluster just dedicated to decks with Kaito? No, I think that they're dedicated to green, blue, and a splash, basically. And actually performing not so bad with 57% win rate. That's not bad for green, blue. Blue, red. Yeah, so this is the deck where I found that there is like one really dominant cluster, and that's the one here. So we can check what's inside here, but we also have some couple of maybe less successful, but possibly interesting clusters. I don't know if that's worth to highlight, honestly. Okay, so first deck, 62.6% win rate, and blue red is not so great. And yet we find clusters when you actually can see 62% win rate over 54 decks, which means that probably a lot of people draft blue red very badly, but actually blue red can have good decks. And this particular build, top card Ichor Synthesizer, 1.6 copies. Then we have Hex Gold Slash, 1.4, Volt Charge, 1.3. So some cheap removal, Ichor Synthesizer, Gitaxian Raptor to stabilize the game, Serum Core Chimera, which is not great, but I guess you get it cheap and it does something. But there is the Furnace Strider. So you want to have some chunkier things. There's actually churning reservoirs in solid numbers. So yeah, there is some oil synergies. There is some proliferate synergies. There is some spell synergies, like a bit of everything in the blue-red package. I think it's not far off from what Sam Black was telling about blue-red, that you want to have early drops, U-shaped curve, bigger threats because you don't have staying long power because the bombs are not strong enough. Yeah, that looks very much like what he was describing as the blue-red archetype. Here we have cluster 1. That's markedly lower win rate. Top card, Hex Gold Slash, then Volt Charge, Butterfist, Strider, Rabble, Engravers, Camp, Blazing Crescendo. This is all red, basically. Then we have like Surgical Skullbomb and Ichor Synthesizer, Serum Core Chimera. And then we get another bunch of red cards. So this is like red decks with some blue added, probably because they have some bomb and blue, potentially. Oh yeah, I would have to dive into this data a bit deeper to know what's in the which decks are in the cluster to measure it. Currently, we don't have that, so I'm sorry to disappoint in this particular case. Here we have cluster number 2, 56%, so similar as the previous one. Anything interesting? It looks very much similar. There is Unctus Retrofitter in this, so there is some more of the. So this, I guess, is the coveted blue-red artifact-based version, which is still similar to the other versions, but it does have a bunch of artifacts: the Skull Bomb, the Butterfist, Watcher, Prowler, Escaped Experiment. All of those are overplayed. Even Eye of Malcator makes it on some of the copies of those, and markedly fewer Gitax and Raptors. So I guess that this is the artifact-based blue-red. And this one has too low of a win rate, honestly. So it looks like the best version of the deck is clearly the one that has some oil synergies and spell synergies and proliferate synergies combined, and picking up the best cards of those. And actually, some churning reservoirs might not be terrible in those decks. Oh, you mean? Oh, sorry. Yeah. So JPSN54 said it's funny to see that the artifact-based blue-red deck seems to be the home for Furnace Skullbomb. Yeah, it is interesting because the card I'm not a big fan, but you can get them late now, and maybe it is playing some role in those decks. I'm just trying to see if you see them also in the trophy versions of those. Furnace Punisher, but no Furnace Spellbomb. It seems like it's a home, but it's the less successful versions of it that play it. So still be aware. Not a single one of those had red skull bomb, which doesn't say much, but it's something to worth considering. And white red. Here is the last color. I mean, we obviously have to go to higher win rate to find the interesting clusters. So this is the strongest cluster. Let's go down a bit and start repopulating. Maybe something on this side, and definitely this one, because I know what it is. Also, maybe this one. Let's see what's in there. So here, this first super focused cluster. Oh yeah, that's a Google issue. I don't know. I don't know why it did it. I talked to Pekka, and we will try to fix it at some stage. But it did some changes to card names based on I don't know what. So cluster 0, 69, just like my episode, 69%, nice win rate. That's super strong. And top cards: Barb Butterfist, Hexgold Slash, Chimney Rabble, Sawblade Scamp at 1.2 copies, which is, I think, pretty interesting for me to see so many Sawblade Scamps in the successful deck over so many decks. So I guess that actually Soulblade Scamp is the secret white-red finisher. Then you have the Blade Graph Aspirant, Brazen Crescendo, Furnace Strider, Whip, that's the splash, Axiom Engraver, Hazardous Blast, Planar Disruption, Volt Charge, Cacophony Scamp, Shrapnel Singer, and Free from Flash. Like ultra aggressive mono red playing Blade Hole War Whip and some maybe other white removal, but you can see that all those decks have few planes and are extremely strong. Oh yeah, Hexgold Hoverwings is the card that I've seen on a couple of lists in there. What else from white cards do we see there? Maybe some swooping lookouts, maybe even some gold warden's helm made it to the list. But yeah, triple soulblade scamp, double soulblade scamp. It seems like there is something about having those soulblade scamps in those white, red, very red, and then some white trophy decks. So yeah, that's one good find. Most successful white red decks have soulblade scams because that maybe deals the very quick damage, and then because you play so many equipment creatures or the Formiridan creatures, you will get counters on it and gets pinging in. Cluster 1, 65% win rate. 1.5 Chimney Rabbles. Okay. Butterfist slash Duelist of Deep Faith, Bladehold War Whip, Justiciar. That's a bit of a weird combination, but just putting a bunch of 2-drops and some toxic, but not much. Huh. Interesting. Let's see how the trophy decks here look like. Engraved, 3 engravers, Crescendo, Indoctrination Attendant, Justiciar, Annex Sentry, Basilica Skullbomb. So this looks like basically someone was trying to draft poison deck and then pivoted into a white-red deck while having already this poison kind of background. And Justiciars are somehow good in those things. Yeah, 2 Bladehold War Whips must be nice. 2 Bladehold War Whips must be nice. But yeah, this looks like a sort of not all-in toxic decks that people started picking up red at some stage. But this is still not what I meant when I talk about white-red toxic deck. This is like half-cooked toxic deck that got lucky because they picked really good red cards at some stage. Okay, cluster 2, by the fact that Bladegraph Aspirant is the top card, I would guess this is like a full all-in kind of equipment deck. Second best card is Barbed Butterfist, Bladehold War Whip. Then we have like Mandible Justiciar, which actually is decent in white-red decks in general, so there is a home for it. Swooping Lookout at high numbers in this deck, which I would guess is useful for having lots of equipment. Volshock Splitter, I guess that's a good card with Aspirant. So this is your white-red equipment deck, and 62% win rate, which is not bad at all. Another cluster, 63% win rate. Again, Bladegraph Aspirant is the top card. So here we have another version of this kind of Hex Gold Hoverwings in this one, quite high as well. We see a lot of those for Mirrodin equipment and Aspirant helping to play them for cheaps and maybe gaining advantage through that. There it is. In cluster number 4, roughly 60% win rate, but the most played card, Duelist of Deep Faith, 1.7 copies over 19 decks, which is quite a lot. And the second most played card is Crawling Chorus. And the third most played card is Flensing Raptor. And then we have Planar Disruption, Incisor Glider, Indoctrination Attendant, Charge of the Mites, Complete Devotion, Basilica Shepherd. All of them white, all of them toxic. So that's basically a mono-white toxic deck, adding some Volt Charges, some Blazing Crescendos, Hex Gold Slashes, and things like that. Just because they could, but basically it's a toxic deck in white-red. It does exist. It has decent results. It has, out of 19 decks that we look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 trophies out of 19, which is pretty good. And this is the reverse of the first cluster that we watched. And actually, when you look at the map, this is the cluster and this is the first cluster. They are sort of on the opposite sides of the blob. And they go from being mono-white to being mono-red as we go across the graph. And here I think that we have sort of red, white, oil kind of thing. Engraver, Rabble, Butterfist, Free from Flesh, Furnace Punisher, Furnace Strider, Planar Disruption. That's just red good cards with some white added in for the lols. Yeah, so that's the last cluster, the one that is located here. I think that it's very interesting, the multiple Soul Blades camp cluster. I didn't expect that. I didn't see it on the first run through that there were so many of them and that it's so consistent over so many decks. So there's definitely something in there. Let's just like casually look at this one. Cluster 6. That's the we don't have Butterfists kind of cluster, I guess. But we still have Blade Graph Aspirants. And it still wins quite a lot because just white red is just a good color combination, even when you have poorer cards in them. Okay, stop the screen, share the screen. Let's put it back on the presentation. All right, so that was the Archetypist for this time. I mean, I highly encourage you to use it on your own and try to explore a bit. Obviously, you have to keep in mind this is not a perfect tool. During the turning of the things to 2 dimensions, there is always some data distortion. So some decks might look odd, and that very might well be because of that distortion, because it's hard to squeeze multi-dimensional space into 2 dimensions. Obviously, because there are limited number of cards in each archetype, some of those clusters will look samey and they will differ very slightly by the ratio. And some of those clusters might be built from decks that were really good in bronze, because that's also something that 17 lens data does have. I'll try to maybe include only platinum up next time, but the problem here was that if I did it, I wouldn't have enough sample size for some of the archetypes, which I find not nice, because then I would have to add gold decks to that, and then we would compare apples and pears a bit. But yeah, I mean, big thanks to Pekka for helping me with the Archetypist. Big thanks to the 17 Lands team for helping me with getting the data and, just being very important for the community altogether. Thanks to my sponsors, both mtgazone.com and the patrons. Unfortunately, this week I don't have a new patron that I can describe, that I can read out. Maybe next week. Maybe next week. And also thanks to Fake Jake Brown, who is helping me on the podcast release, editing, and everything involved with it side. And as we are on the podcast topic, thanks to Asescu and Mana Junkie for the music I'm using as a starter. And with that, I'll see you next week. And we'll guess, I don't even know what topic is going to be next week, but I'll try to make it something generic and not necessarily 100% all about one. I'll try to make something universal that spans multiple formats. But with that, see you next week.